Good morning, or good afternoon or evening, depending on when you're watching this interview. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast, and I'm joined here with Tyler Cooper, editor of Broadband Now. And we're going to be talking about Broadband Now's latest Q4 report on broadband speeds. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for being here with us, Tyler. In the new year and looking back on the fourth quarter of 2020. Welcome, and tell us a little bit about these quarterly reports that Broadband Now does.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. Happy to be here, as always. Our quarterly reports are really just a sort of culmination of all of the ongoing data updates and processing that we do on our site every single quarter. So this is essentially just a top-down look at what's changed in terms of both access and speed and internet performance overall over the prior quarter. So what we're seeing here is just sort of a summation of everything that has changed, and we'll get into those details here in a moment, but a lot of that has to do with sort of expansion of plans at the lower end of the cost matrices, and also looking at performance overall and seeing that latency has improved in many areas around the country.
Let's talk a little bit about that key finding about low-priced broadband plans. You have bulletin pointed that 70% of Americans had access to low-priced wired broadband plans, compared with 52% year over year in the fourth quarter 2019 report. So talk to us about that 52% to 70% increase. What does it mean for those Americans to have access to a low-priced wired broadband plan?
Great question. Yeah, so we've been using that term for a while now, and the way we initially defined it is any standalone broadband internet plan that meets the FCC's minimum definition, 25.3, that costs $60 or less per month. So if there is at least one plan available in a given area, we count that as being covered by low-price broadband. So yeah, looking over the past year, we've seen that number increase pretty substantially, from 52% to 70%. And a lot of that actually happened really over the last two quarters, and even the last quarter in particular from last year. So it's pretty interesting. I think, one thing that has spurred that along is we've seen a lot of providers that have extended or expanded their sort of low-cost broadband plans that were previously tied down by some sort of qualification. We've seen a lot of them expand those plans to be, many of them have had plans that, previously required some participation in a federal lifeline program that have now expanded to be purely income-based. Several other, situations like that, but also we've just seen, new tiers of existing infrastructure kind of come online. We've seen certain providers that have launched, for example, Xfinity Performance Starter and Performance Select plans. Those launched in December at a lower price point. So, we're seeing a lot of providers sort of both adding new plans and also sort of expanding existing offerings to more areas.
What's the definitional threshold you use for a low-priced broadband plan? What's the dollars per month to meet that threshold?
Oh, that's what I'll say. Yeah, so $60 a month or less is the minimum. Yeah.
So, and do you put a speed benchmark on that as well, or could a $40 plan, but with still pretty low speeds, will that qualify?
It will. So yeah, we basically use the FCC's current definition for this metric. So anything that meets the 25 megabit per second download, 3 megabit per second upload threshold is calculated in this statistic.
Speaking of which, obviously we addressed a lot about the gigabit speeds in our last meeting, our last interview. Do you rank and sort broadband by speed somewhere between 25.3 and 1,000, which is what a gigabit symmetrical is? Do you have like additional gradations or settings that, so to speak, that one can search your data set for, Tyler?
Not specifically. So on our individual data pages, you can obviously sort by speed and technology. So you can see at a glance, which providers offer, for instance, fiber to the home in an area, which would obviously be, gigabit. But in our reporting that we do on the quarterly reports, we've actually started to measure sort of another essentially tier. So instead of the sort of anything under this umbrella goes, we've started measuring this tier of 100 megabits per second download and 25 upload, just to sort of create another sort of line in the sand to
The
show.
FCC isn't doing it, so someone's got to do it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think it's useful to sort of push the conversation forward beyond the minimum, right? I think it's interesting to see how the number changes when you just raise it by what I would consider a pretty modest amount. 100 over 25 is not a shocking, increase. So.
Great. So we've seen this increase in low priced broadband, 60 or lower, across the country from 52% to 70%. And you mentioned Rhode Island being the state with the highest percentage of residents with access to low priced plans with 100 megabit down and 25 megabit up. And Rhode Island is the most urban state, as I understand it. So I am assuming that accounts for a lot of that.
Certainly.
Yeah. I'm also wondering if you want to mention anything about the Alaska situation. You mentioned that for the first time, residents in Alaska have access to low price plans. What are some of the issues associated with broadband in Alaska that you've observed?
Certainly, yeah. Well, Alaska is sort of the opposite of Rhode Island in that sense, right? There's vast swaths of rural land, obviously, really spaced out communities. And you hear stories, some communities require, special vehicles to get to, right? You can't just drive in a lot of cases. And so, yeah, I think for as long as we've been doing this report, Alaska has not shown that there is anyone, in the data that can get a low price broadband plan as we've defined it. And that changed for the last quarter. So yeah, I think that's, it's just, sort of a portend, hopefully, of what's to come. I think because as we mentioned, only less than 1% of the population has this access now, but there are areas that do have this. A plan that is less than $60 a month. So it's progress. I mean, that means that all 50 states plus the District of Columbia now have some form of low price broadband. And obviously, as we sort of continue to measure this, we hope to see that expand a bit more rapidly in Alaska. And hopefully, with some of the technologies we've discussed over the past few months, like low Earth orbit, we'll see that happen across a number of fronts.
Cool. Well, let's move on to our next topic. We talk a lot about download speeds and upload speeds, but there's a third metric that probably gets a little short shrift in the constant discussion of 25 down and 3 up, or 100 down and 25 up, or 1 down and 1 up, 1 gigabit down, and that's latency. Could you define for our audience what exactly is latency, and the other word you use here, round trip time, and why is it important to understand latency and round trip time? Tyler.
Certainly. So yeah, I mean, at a very basic level, you might hear latency referred to as ping sometimes, but it's essentially just the measurement of how long it takes data to go, from your local environment to wherever it's going to go on the wider internet and then back to you, right? Or vice versa. So how long it takes for data to traverse this sort of highway that it has to traverse and then come back to you with information. And, that's a really simplistic way of understanding it. But what that means functionally is if you are doing something like what we're doing right now, having a, Zoom call in HD over the internet, right now, both of our connections are having to send data back and forth to each other at a fast rate so that we can sort of have a normal human conversation, right? If we both had extremely high latency, this would be very difficult to do. It would appear that we were talking over each other a lot. There'd be issues of, desync and things of that nature. So right now, as millions of Americans are relying on things like Zoom and also virtual work environments that are quite robust, distance learning in some areas, the latency of their connection is pretty important because it's going to determine how effectively they can sort of handle these tasks and how productive they can be, while potentially staying at home.
So let's talk a little bit here about how you basically measure some of these different points about ping, latency, round trip time. For example, what I'm trying to get at, Tyler, is you mentioned that It impacts video conferencing. And you said that 21 states had improved or steady internet latency compared to Q3, when there were 7 that remained steady. So just again, talk us through how you measure latency when you do this broadband report every quarter, and where we've seen, in a general sense, improvements or at least continued progress.
Certainly. So yeah, all of our speed test data in general comes from ImLab's network diagnostic tool, speed test. So this is open source data that you can go and see. ImLabs releases this periodically, and it's available for the public as well. But essentially, this is data that's generated from users doing speed tests, right? So they'll run a speed test, and that'll essentially say, okay, you're getting this much upload speed, you're getting this much download speed. But then if you've ever run speed tests, there's also this third number, which is, sometimes listed as ping, sometimes as latency, but essentially that number will tell you how long it actually takes for, that data to ping back to you, how long it takes for it to come back after you sort of send out the test. And normally these sort of ImLabs tests and others like it send out to a server that is somewhere relatively close to you. So it tries to identify a server that's going to be best. Obviously, if you're in somewhere that's further away from a test server, you might have a higher ping, right? You might have a worse case of latency, which is no surprise why we often see, areas like Hawaii have higher ping, right? Because it's like, there may be less servers available in that area. Most of them are, in the contiguous United States. So we're going to see higher latency because it has a literal ocean to cross, versus somewhere like New Jersey, as we mentioned, which is very urban. There's probably a wide variety of testing centers in the area. So your results will naturally be quite a bit better.
Excellent. It's good to see that, and good to see that you're ranking the latency progress there by state, and do you also measure latency by different technology types, Tyler?
Yes. So that's not something that we do in this report specifically, but certainly. So like if whenever you look at speed test results, it doesn't say, hey, this one's on a fiber connection or this one's on a, DSL connection, right? That information's not in there. So it's pretty difficult to say with certainty that like, oh, this subset of data is coming from this connection or this type of connection, and this one's coming from another. But it is something that you can measure sort of in more specific cases if you wanted to look at something that's like a crowdsourced test. But we're always looking for ways to sort of at a higher level look at that data and say, it makes sense that obviously like a fiber connection would have less latency, right, than like a DSL connection, just in terms of the technology itself. But it's difficult to say, in which state is, this particular technology causing the most dropout there.
Well, good to see that that's being measured and that there's some progress. Let's move to the last area of the report, Tyler, the recap, and you have a number of points that you bulleted here. I'll let you kind of pick and choose what you think is most important to highlight here among the items you mentioned in your recap.
Sure. Yeah. Well, this has been a busy quarter, right? There was a lot happening in the industry over the past several months. We've seen a number of things you and I have discussed on previous episodes, like RDOF, that getting underway. That was big, as we were talking about offline. SpaceX was a large winner there, and they're sort of rolling out and expanding their plans to kind of get a wider commercial service online this year, hopefully, which is exciting to see that sort of starting to crystallize. I think we've all been talking about, low Earth orbit for quite a while. It's interesting to see it kind of enter the next phase. So that is pretty cool. Obviously, we have a new administration now, and that was, not something that necessarily happened last quarter, but sort of, plans were set in place, and we're obviously seeing this wider shift at the FCC. So a lot of that will be pretty interesting to see what happens, both in the short term and the long term, with a new acting chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, in place. It'd be interesting to see sort of if there is any sort of larger strategic shift in the FCC in the way that they're even reporting this information. You and I have talked a lot about 477 data. It'd be interesting to see if there's any sort of chatter about changing that systemically.
Let me jump in on that, Tyler, not to cut you off, but But on January 19th, just a few days ago, a week and change ago, the FCC released the final order in the digital opportunity data collection proceeding. This is basically after 3 rounds. They said, look, we're going to lay out the rules, and the digital opportunity data collection will, it is anticipated, it is stated, will replace the Form 477 after some period of continuous reporting. DODC, so it becomes really kind of the final thing that former FCC Chairman Ajit Pai did on his way out the door to kind of shore up data reporting, address some of the holes in FCC data, and we'll kind of see how it results once the details get implemented now that they've been released. So I just thought it'd be useful to mention that, because that will very much have an impact on broadband data going forward into this next administration.
Certainly. Well said. Yeah.
Well, last topic perhaps, and I don't know if you were going to get to this and I just kind of jumped in, but could you speak a little about the emergency broadband benefit, which you did mention in your report and which is going to factor into the landscape soon?
Yeah, certainly. So, as part of the latest stimulus package, there was $7 billion set aside to increase access to broadband, including this emergency broadband benefit, which, the idea here is to essentially provide broadband credit to individuals to stay online, sort of as we move into this hopefully final phase of the pandemic. I think there's reason to be optimistic there. But yeah, so eligible households can receive up to $50 per month to pay for broadband services from participating providers. The way I understand it, this money is not given out directly, but is actually sort of done in conjunction with providers who are participating with this. So there's, I think it's $3.2 billion in total that's specifically earmarked for this emergency fund. And for anyone who wants to sort of pursue receiving those funds, it's actually a matter of going directly through your provider. So if they're participating in this, it's something that you can sign up for through them.
Wonderful. Great to hear about the report that you've assembled, which is the latest of your continuing quarterly reports, which includes a refresh of the data that's available on BroadbandNow.com. Broadband Breakfast is very excited to continue our partnership with BroadbandNow, and we're grateful for your support of this video sponsored discussion. Until we meet again, Tyler, great to hear from you. And we look forward to staying in touch, as always, at broadbandbreakfast.com and broadbandnow.com. Thank you very much. Take care.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.